An absolute oddity of its time, 1984's Suffer Little Children holds the rare distinction of being a film born of the video nasty era that was investigated by the police, but was ultimately not added to the DPP's list of banned works, despite the fact that this film features murderous children and gore galore. You see, Suffer Little Children was a bit of an experiment, with the domestic video camera market finally coming down in price enough that the public could realistically afford to pick one up. It led to many an aspiring filmmaker wanting to nab their own movie camera so that they could finally realise their creative visions. Enter Alan Briggs, a man in a bad place at the right time. Alan was a rock promoter, and a quite successful one at that. He owned, at the time, one of Britain's largest nightclubs, and things were going pretty alright for him. That is until a divorce, allegedly, pretty much cleared him out of everything. Down on his luck, he saw the boom in the domestic video camera business and began to formulate an idea. What if you shot an actual feature film on one of those cameras? Would it be profitable? Could it be profitable? Well, Alan was about to find out. He reached out to a close friend and future wife, Meg Shanks, who was the owner of a local drama school, with a simple proposition. He wanted to make a movie, and Meg had several drama students and creatives who were looking at their chance to make it big. Could they make it work? Well, yes. Yes, they could. The pair decided, rather than trying to coerce the students, who ranged from between the ages of 7 to 35, into making a film they'd had no involvement in, that they'd let the students set the agenda, with Alan and Meg choosing only the genre, contemporary horror, mainly because it was cheap and easy to do, and the location, a derelict house on a row of terrace houses that were due to be demolished. Other than that, the students made the narrative, they constructed the scenes, they created the characters, they helped dress the sets, some split off into crewing roles with lighting, sound and recording. The parents of the students were brought in to assist with chaperoning and to help flesh out the cast and crew a bit more, and all of this was bottlenecked through Meg and Alan, with Meg taking the ideas and moulding it into a loose, workable script, and Alan working with the kids to create feasible to direct sequences. So, what did they come up with? Well, the film opens with a caption saying that this is a reconstruction of the terrifying events that took place at a very well-respected children's home. The head staff members are Jen, a fairly sensible and vibrant lady, and Morris, a more timid by-the-books counterpart. The pair are settling in for the afternoon, having pretty much done all of their work for the day, when there's a knock at the door, and on the doorstep is a little girl clutching a carrier bag full of things and not much else. This is Elizabeth, and it appears that she's been abandoned to the mercy of the kids' home. They bring her in and try to get some answers out of her, but she's completely mute, and the best answers they can get out of her come from a note she was sent with, which simply tells the pair her name, that she can't talk, and that whoever it was that abandoned her believed that the children's home was the best place for her. The pair feel awful about her situation and decide to take her to the kitchen for some food and drink. After continuing to try and talk to her, she eventually sheepishly drinks some hot chocolate, but doesn't do much of anything else. While she's in the kitchen, they go through Liz's things, but there isn't really much there. A coat, 2 jumpers, some socks, and a doll is all there is. After double-checking her possessions, Morris decides to take Liz out to the living room ahead of a Sunday lunch to meet the other kids, who have become increasingly curious about her and her situation. While heading out of the kitchen though, some of the kids are really quite mean to her, and it's here that we get our first inkling that something isn't quite right, as, after being bullied a bit by the kids, Liz goes all spooky-eyed and one of the kids gets a door slammed directly into their face, causing a pretty nasty head injury. The staff, however, write it off as the kid just not paying attention where they were going. The next day, a big announcement hits the children's home. A former resident of the home is coming back to see how the place is holding up, and to share his memories of his time in care. But this is no normal former resident. This is Mick Phillips, one of the hottest rock and pop sensations currently on the circuit. Jen is delighted to have a big name coming to the home, as she thinks it'll really help raise awareness of children in care. Morris, however, is less pleased with the situation, thinking that Mick's basically just looking for a few good publicity moments and a few more album sales. In either case, Mick arrives with his friend and fellow bandmate, Hustler. After spending some time with the kids, Mick heads off to the staff room to chat with Jen and Morris, where he explains it's been about 8 years since he was here last, and that he was a bit of a troublemaker at the time. Which only upsets Morris even further, as he seems convinced that Mick's going to start offering the kids drugs in the same way that I might offer someone a nice biscuit to go with their cup of tea. Towards the end of the visit, just before leaving, Mick meets Elizabeth, who seems oddly perplexed by Mick's crucifix necklace. She doesn't say anything, and Jen loosely explains her situation to Mick, who very kindly gives Liz his necklace as a keepsake before heading off. That night, however, strange goings-on occur, as while the other children sleep, Liz goes into a trance-like state and infects the dreams of 2 of the girls in the same room as her. She turns an adventure into the woods into an abstract nightmare, as zombies emerge out of nowhere and try to attack everyone. The girls flee and eventually find Liz having a picnic. She summons them to sit at her picnic, which they do, and the zombies join them. In the real world, however, the girls, now in a trance-like state, have left their beds and have lay on Liz's lap where she gently strokes their hair. The next morning, the kids are getting breakfast when Jen gets a phone call from the local doctors. They examined Liz off screen and the results have come back. Physically, she's totally fine, nothing to report. So they believe her being mute is the result of either some kind of psychological issue or some form of trauma manifest. In either case, they say that, other than therapies, which will take some time, there isn't a lot they can do about it, and the best thing they can keep doing is just talking to her, checking in and making sure she's alright. This then also leads to a conversation where Jen and Morris chat about whether Liz is right for the home given her complex needs, and they start to discuss whether a more specialised facility might be better for her. While this is going on, however, Liz and the 2 possessed girls are listening in from outside the door. At the bottom of the stairs, a disabled boy by the name of Basil is slowly climbing the stairs and starts questioning why the girls are hanging around outside the staff office. Liz does the spooky eyes again, however, and Basil is sent flying down the staircase, critically injuring himself to the point that he's fully unconscious and bleeding badly. Jen hears the commotion and her and Morris call an ambulance, but spot Liz and the girls nearby. Later that evening, the pair take the 2 possessed girls into a room and ask them exactly what happened to Basil, as he's now in critical care in a coma. They both simultaneously tell them that Basil just fell, and that there was nothing more to it. Jen and Morris don't really believe that for a second though, as the girls both sound incredibly nonchalant about the whole affair. They get them both to write independent written statements, but they both come out exactly identical, which if anything makes the pair even more suspicious due to the precise wordings matching. After dismissing the girls, Jen asks Morris what he thinks happened. He says he thinks the girls were trying to steal Mick's crucifix necklace from Liz, Basil got in the way, so they pushed him and didn't realise he was so close to the stairs. An accident, but not one without huge consequences. Around this time, Jen gets a surprise when Mick reaches out to her again to ask if she'd be interested in going for a drink sometime. Morris has his doubts, but she accepts anyway, and the pair go for a bit of a boogie and then on for a couple of quiet drinks at a bar. The pair get back to the children's home and Jen opens up a bit about all of the strange happenings that have occurred since Liz came to the house. She explains that the house is an award-winning location. Incidents just don't happen, and yet, in the space of a few days, more accidents and oddities have happened than have happened in the last few years. The next day, there's a bit of a time skip as we hear Jen and Morris discussing an incident that happened earlier that day. Apparently, Jen took the kids to the swimming baths for lessons and a bit of a mess around, and 6 kids nearly ended up drowning. This is unusual enough in and of itself, but 3 or 4 of the 6 kids who did nearly drown were all very strong swimmers who started acting like they wanted to drown. Morris suggests that it may have been some form of mass hysteria, but Jen also mentions that when she tried to swim out to the deep end to rescue them, some of the other kids grabbed onto a swimming costume and stopped her from moving. If it hadn't been for the lifeguard on duty, the 6 would have died. At the same time, Liz and the girls have converted a room in the house on the upper floors into a place for black magic and rituals, from which they begin doing freaky spells. There's a party planned for later in the afternoon, and Jen invites Mick over, once again annoying Morris. When he turns up, he's bought a high-end hi-fi system for the kids to boogie down to some badass tunes. The party seems to be in full swing, but Liz and the girls are still in the attic doing demonic shit. So you know the mood isn't going to be merry for very much longer. Morris finally gets a bit of time with Mick, and the pair finally manage to push past the frosty receptions. Morris admits that he was nervous about having a larger-than-life personality getting involved with the children, that he feels a bit intimidated with Mick around, and it's implied that Morris has feelings for Jen that's only further caused ill will towards Mick. That last point gets put on the back burner, however, as shortly after it begins to surface, a full-blown brawl breaks out in the party room. The pair rush in and try to separate as many kids as they can, but no sooner have they pulled one of the kids away, they're straight back in again fighting someone else. Liz and the girls are nowhere to be found. And it's here really that we enter our final act. As Jen and Morris begin to become increasingly suspicious of Liz and more horrific events begin to unfold as Liz's power begins to take full form, the children in the home will quickly begin to find themselves answering to a higher power than the staff. The devil himself. In a strangely compelling 75 minutes of experimental theatre, will Jen and Morris suss out Liz? Will Mick and Jen finally get it together? And hey, is that Jesus? All this and more will be answered if you check out Suffer Little Children. And I should probably preface my thoughts on this film by saying this was shot in late 1983 and early 1984. At this point in time, as far as I can see, there had been between 2 and 5 entirely SOV-produced feature films ever made. At least one of which is up for debate, Boarding House, because it was shot on tape and distributed on film. This is a very, very early example of SOV cinema, in almost every sense of the word. There wasn't an established workflow, there wasn't a widely known way to do it at this point. And hell, this, I believe, was one of, if not the first entirely SOV feature film to be shot in the UK. As far as I can see, both Alan and Meg had no idea about the advancements taking place in the US around this time. In short, this was an experiment to see if the UK market would be interested in an entirely video-based production. They had nothing to go off and, at minimum, were basically treating this as a school assignment that would help the kids learn how to act for TV and film and to better understand the production process behind filmmaking. Because of this, the scripting process was a largely collaborative effort, with the kids shaping almost every aspect of it and Meg working it into a high-level script. On the day when a scene came up, both Alan and Meg would encourage the kids to improvise or come up with a new scene in addition to what was needed to be shot that day. They'd literally trial and error everything, and what worked would go into the mix and even potentially lead to entirely new scenes and scenarios having to be filmed to fill in the gaps. It's an interesting approach to filmmaking, and I think it creates a very unusually toned production. Pacing-wise, it's a flop. The film has an interesting 10 to 15 minute opening and a downright bizarre 10 to 15 minute closing section that has to be seen to be believed. But outside of that, there's maybe 5 to 10 minutes of genuinely unsettling and interesting plotting. The dream sequence with Liz and the girls is a noteworthy one, that's then unfortunately bogged down by 35 minutes of padding. Given the committee approach to the scriptwriting process, and given that they were literally making the film with a next to nothing budget, they were so low on budget that when they found out the house they were shooting in had no staircase, they sent some of the older kids to the next house over, which was also derelict, to steal their staircase and install it in the shooting house. I'm not making that up. It's kind of inevitable that this thing would have to stall for time in places to get it up to runtime. After all, if you're limited on budget and can't do multiple locations, talking is about all you can do. This has good sides and bad sides. On the positive, the sheer amount of weird conversations adds to the woozy dreamlike vibe this film has across the runtime. It also makes the gorier, more horror-driven moments of the film feel much more of a bigger deal than they would have had that aspect been consistent across the runtime. The negative is that it leaves the film floundering around the second act. The after-the-fact discussion about the near-fatal trip to the swimming pool reeks of we had it in mind but couldn't afford to shoot it, and those limitations do hang around this film's neck like a millstone. Equally, because it's majoritively improvised work, it does mean a lot of the production starts to drift into incoherency, as you have 20 kids all shouting their improv line out simultaneously, and the moments with minor characters that feel like they should have been fleshed out a bit more just ultimately weren't. A level of inexperience on behalf of the filmmakers is also present, with staff members like Kath and Elaine being introduced for a handful of scenes, but never really developed, and then used basically as cannon fodder in the last act, with very little else to show for it. It ultimately ends up being a weird situation where a good 4 or 5 staff members were introduced and developed to a point, and then they just got forgotten as it became the Jen and Morris show featuring Mick. Outside of Liz and her possessed underlings, the kids themselves don't really get to develop much of a personality or character either. The kids are seemingly just extras. They get occasional lines or situations to be involved in, but nothing substantial. Which, given this was committee driven by the kids, I find it odd that only 3 to 5 of them actually get anything meaningful to do in the film, while Jen, Maurice and Mick get the real limelight. Tonally, it's a bit lopsided too. It can't quite decide how thrillery and how horror-y it wants to be, and furthermore, on the horror front, it can't decide how gory or how psychological it wants to be. In an interview with Alan available on the Suffer Little Children DVD, he stated that he would, at regular intervals, ask the kids if they felt he'd gone far enough in the gruesomeness, and that they'd almost always tell him to go much further. There are some lighter comedic moments dotted throughout, but nothing consistent. It's basically exactly what you'd expect from a film that was planned by tweens, written by a schoolteacher and shot by a rock promoter. Characters don't really get a chance to grow or develop. Everyone who's still alive by the end is pretty much exactly the same as they were at the beginning. The dialogue quality is all over the place as well, with some strong lines in the first and third acts, but very little else in the middle. It's a half-decent idea that kinda gets lost in the melting pot. As such, it's a bit of a slog assuming you didn't know the journey this film went on to get where it got. The film was written by Meg Shanks and directed by Alan Briggs. They both only have 1 active credit on IMDb, this film. But Alan apparently has 2 more credits to his name. One being a 10-minute short from 2017 called School of Shock that I can find 0 information on online other than Alan directed it and played a part in it, and the other film being a film from 1986 called Ghetto Wars, which isn't linked to his IMDb. Alan at one point had also apparently planned to make a sequel to Suffer Little Children around the mid-2010s, though it unfortunately didn't come to pass. Both Meg and Alan as of 2021 also appear to have sadly passed away, though specific dates of their deaths appear to be difficult to track down. The assumption would be that Meg passed away at some point between 2009 and 2017, as Alan alludes to Meg's passing in his interview on the DVD, and Alan passed away at some point between 2019 and 2021. On the direction front, it's rudimentary. I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Alan has some experience from shooting various promotional materials, but he was more suited to music video environments, which means when it comes to shooting the mundane, he really seems to struggle a bit to bring it to life. In these moments, it's fairly flat, blunt and uninspired. However, when the more abstract sequences start up or things start getting a bit heavier, his real creative flair begins to flourish, as we get some genuinely creative and interesting stylization. There wasn't really so much a crew to speak of for this production. Most of it was Alan and Meg, or Alan and some of the older kids manning effects, lighting or audio elements. Communication seems to have been largely fine, if not a little tense, but these are amateurs in their field working with what they know or less at best. Direction of the cast is vague and broad too. Instructions seem to have been about as complex as make a noise when she says this line or walk off when this happens. And that's about it. Literally 1 or 2 basic instructions led by a cue mark, and that's it. I mean, they're fine at doing that, and I do have to give them some leeway to the fact that these were drama students learning their craft. Most of them were under 14 years old, so I can't really be too harsh on what they did here. I just kind of wish there had been more though. Again, given this was predominantly made by kids, supervised by a couple of adults, I can't be too harsh on just how basic it really is, and the more interesting moments do elevate the film a bit to something much more interesting. It's a bit trite to say, but the filmmaker's enthusiasm and spirit is captured in this film, and that's the element that I feel saves it from being a fairly dull project, honestly. The same goes for the Cine too, really. Barring some interesting shenanigans at the end of the film, which I won't go into here, it's all pretty by the numbers. It's ultra basic compositions and simple sequences. Super low budget effects, we're talking about floating objects on fishing line level cheap here that do manage to tell the story, but not that much else. The more out there sequences, again, do pull the film up quite a bit quality-wise, but they are way too few and far between to really significantly improve the film's overall quality. What I will say is that there are some nice lighting choices. There's plenty of B-roll on show, they seem to get the balance between telling and showing about right, and they leave plenty of crumbs for the audience to try and piece together what's going on without actually just flat out telling them what's happening. This is somewhat compounded by the edit, which again, I need to stress, for the time, they had no idea what a good or bad SOV edit really was. But here, it's not great. There are a few choice cuts here and there, but quite often scenes cut to black because they mistimed the blanking, snow can be seen in a couple of places where they hit the record button a bit too late, and cuts are uneven and poorly paced. It does affect the viewing experience and it makes it difficult to really truly settle into the film. But at the same time, these guys were doing this with almost no prior experience, so I feel very harsh for holding them to the standards of, let's say, a mid-80s SOV horror film where people had managed to get their shit together at least a little bit more because of what had come previously. Performance-wise, as per my own moral code, I won't comment on the child actors. I will say that our core cast of Morris, Jenny and Mick, Colin Chamberlain, Ginny Rose and John Hollands respectively, are all fine. For SOV, they're brilliant, but for general film, I've seen better. But I have absolutely seen worse. These guys are animate in their deliveries, maybe a touch slower on the physical performances, but they feel natural and fluid for the most part. The delivery of lines are a little stilted in places, but on the whole, I found them to be inoffensive and in places actually quite enjoyable. I go as far as to say they were a very good reason to tune in, really. And finally, the soundtrack. It's good. Really good. Given a lot of this genre of filmmaking, scorings tend to just go cheap and cheerful with a tinny synth and, depending on the filmmaker's thoughts on copyright law, occasionally just recorded off a cassette player copyrighted music. Here, we have a prominent and bassy synthy score combined with some punk and rock compositions, presumably pulled from acts that Alan had worked with in a previous life. They give this film a lot of character and it really helps to take things to the next level. It's used effectively, feels appropriate, and gets the job done. It would almost certainly be one I'd be interested in hearing a cleaned up version of, honestly. What is of note as well is the audio mixing. According to a few sources online, several people have complained about the mixing of this film's sound, thinking that it was just poor recording practices on set. I personally can't say that I noticed anything out of the ordinary quality-wise, it kinda just does what it needs to. It gets a tiny bit muffled in places, but nothing I wouldn't expect from an SOV production. Apparently, however, this is actually an error on the version of the film supplied for its DVD run, which does differ slightly from the original VHS release, but more on that in a minute. Suffer Little Children's release history is almost as wild as the plot of the movie itself. So filming overall took 14 to 15 days, at which point it entered a rather intense period of post-production. Alan managed to get a work print into the hands of several distributors, one of which being a smaller label called Films Galore, of whom Alan said was run by an absolute madman who believed he had travelled with aliens and aspired to be a Fagin-type character who controlled armies of small thieving children. So, perfect person you want distributing your movie. Mid-post-production, the Video Recordings Act of 1984 came into effect, requiring all videos to be sent to the BBFC for classification. Suffer Little Children was sent in, but the owner of Films Galore didn't have time for that bullshit. So, without warning Alan or Meg, he just released an unfinished version of the film to video stores and advised sellers to trade it under the counter. This immediately got the police involved, who raided Films Galore's offices and seized all the master tapes and the dub of the version that had been leaked to the stores. The owner was arrested and the police informed Meg and Alan that they were both being investigated for a breach of the Obscene Publications Act, the Video Recordings Act, and the Protection of Children Act, all three of which carried serious jail time if a conviction was raised. Luckily for Alan and Meg, the pair were able to convince the police that no children were in any danger throughout the making of the film. In fact, all the parents were very supportive of the project and even helped to fundraise a gala premiere for the film when an initial cut had been completed. And once it became clear that this was just a case of some nutter doing the exact opposite of the wishes of the actual filmmakers, the original masters and dubs were returned with a caution to the pair that they needed to wrap up whatever shenanigans they had going on, and not to do this again or there really would be a police response. Alan completed the final edit of Suffer Little Children in 1985, and the film was re-released to shops with full BBFC backing. They initially wanted 2 minutes across 7 scenes trimming down, which was then relaxed before the release. When the film came out, it did do relatively well for a very brief spell, and then was all but forgotten by 1986, where it pretty much remained until Severin Films' sub-label Intervision got its hands on distribution and re-released the film in 2017. Though, somewhat controversially, the 2017 DVD release of this film varies quite a bit from the 1985 cut that was put out by Films Galore. For starters, and thanks to Horrified Magazine for doing a deep dive on this one, the sound mix on the original VHS release is quite different from the DVD release. The VHS mix raises the vocals and turns down the music. Some scenes run shorter on the VHS version, mainly gore being removed. There are 3 or 4 whole scenes that are missing from the DVD version that are included on the VHS version, including a scene of the kids getting ready to go to the swimming pool, which really helps add a bit more context to the whole swimming pool scene in the first place. The titles and credits are different on the VHS version. Basically, it looks like Alan provided Intervision with an earlier cut of the film than what initially made it out in 1985. Meaning 2 things. 1, that there isn't now a definitive way to watch Suffer Little Children, as you either have to miss out on the gore for the 85 VHS version, or you miss out on some semi-important scenes if you go for the 2017 DVD version. And 2, unless you're willing to take a punt on trying to hunt down an original VHS release of this, the current asking price is between £125 and £200, and then painstakingly re-editing the film using both sources to create a final cut, you won't get the full experience no matter which film you pick. For what it's worth, I'd probably just try and find a DVD copy of the movie. They're allegedly still in print, there's plenty about on eBay and the likes, and the extra features include an interview with Alan, which was very useful in understanding how the film came to be, and an interview with a film historian that explains the legal issues the film experienced. The picture quality is kinda mixed, but this is supposedly the best source material the film has, and is now likely to be the only source material the film has. All in all, despite being a bit on the slow side, I quite enjoyed Suffer Little Children. Yes, it's a 75-minute film that absolutely could have been 45 minutes and 10 times better, but I'm just amazed at the ingenuity of the cast and crew to even consider getting something like this off the ground. Like I say, SOV movies at this point still weren't really a thing, so to not only do that, but to experiment with seeing what would happen if kids made a movie in that medium, well, I found that far more impressive than the end product, frankly. It absolutely has its moments, and I feel like if you can overlook the slower points, you'll find a film with a lot of heart. Suffer Little Children is absolutely a film you don't want to miss this summer, and I could easily see myself going back to it again in the not too distant future.